He was 12 years old when the shrapnel tore through his jaw and mouth. 12 years old when he helped pull wounded sailors from the burning wreckage of their ship. And 12 years old when the United States Navy awarded him the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star for heroism under fire. But Calvin Graham should never have been there at all. He should have been sitting in a classroom in Fort Worth, Texas, worrying about homework and weekend plans, not standing on the deck of a warship as Japanese bombers screamed overhead and explosions ripped the night apart. The story of how a child ended up in one of the most violent naval battles of the Pacific War is not just about one boy's desperate lie. It's about an America so hungry for young men to feed into the war machine that nobody looked too closely at the face staring back from the recruitment line. It's about a system that failed at every level, and about a kid who paid the price for a country's willingness to believe what it needed to believe. Calvin was born in Canton, Texas, in 1930, into a world that would soon teach him that childhood was a luxury some people couldn't afford. His father died when Calvin was young, and his mother remarried a man whose idea of discipline involved fists and fury. The home became a place of fear rather than safety. Calvin and his older brother learned quickly that staying out of sight meant staying out of reach, that there were only so many places to hide in a small Texas house where violence simmered just beneath the surface. School offered little escape. Calvin was small for his age, and the other kids noticed. They noticed everything. In the schoolyard hierarchy where size equaled power, Calvin learned to make himself invisible, to move through the halls like a shadow. But invisibility at school meant he had to return home eventually, back to the place where his stepfather's temper could erupt over anything or nothing at all. By the time Calvin was 11, he had already started thinking about running away. His older brother had done it, simply vanishing one day and never coming back. Calvin didn't blame him. The question wasn't whether to leave, but where to go and how to survive once he got there. Then, in December 1941, everything changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor didn't just shock America into war. It opened a door that Calvin Graham hadn't known existed. Suddenly, the radio crackled with urgent voices calling for men to enlist, to serve, to become heroes. Recruitment posters appeared on every street corner, showing strong-jawed soldiers and sailors standing proud in uniform. The message was clear and intoxicating. Join up, prove yourself, become someone. For a boy who felt powerless in every corner of his life, who endured daily humiliation and violence with no way to fight back, the idea of putting on a uniform and commanding respect was almost unbearably appealing. Calvin started watching the recruitment offices. He studied the men who went in and came out transformed, their civilian clothes traded for navy blues or army khakis. He noticed something crucial. The recruiters were overwhelmed. Lines stretched down the block as America's young men rushed to enlist. The officers processing them were trying to handle dozens of recruits every hour, checking paperwork, administering quick physicals, and moving people through as fast as possible. In that chaos, Calvin saw his chance. The problem, of course, was obvious. He was 11 years old, about to turn 12, and he looked even younger. His voice hadn't changed. He barely needed to shave. The minimum age for military service was 17, and even that required parental consent. 18 meant you could enlist on your own. Calvin was 6 years away from that threshold, and every inch of his small frame announced his age to anyone who bothered to look. But Calvin had learned something about adults during his short, difficult life. He had learned that people see what they expect to see, and that if you acted confident enough, if you stood tall and spoke with certainty, adults would sometimes accept your version of reality, rather than question it. He had watched his older brother forge their mother's signature on school notes. He had seen men lie about their work experience to get jobs. The world, he realized, ran on small deceptions that everyone tacitly agreed not to examine too closely. So Calvin began practicing. He practiced deepening his voice, dropping it to a register that sounded more like 16 than 12. He practiced standing differently, squaring his shoulders and lifting his chin the way he saw soldiers do. He borrowed his older brother's razor and made a show of shaving the non-existent stubble from his face, teaching his hands the motion so it would look natural if anyone asked. He studied how teenage boys moved and talked, the casual swagger they affected, the way they referenced things he knew nothing about but could pretend to understand. The next part was trickier. He needed documentation, some kind of proof that he was old enough to enlist. Birth certificates could be checked, but in the chaos of wartime recruitment, with thousands of young men flooding the system every day, Calvin gambled that a confident assertion backed by forged paperwork would be enough. He practiced writing in a hand that looked different from his own, copied an older boy's signature style, and created a birth certificate that aged him 6 years. The forgery was crude, but Calvin was betting it wouldn't matter. He was betting that the recruiters, desperate to fill their quotas and faced with endless lines of eager volunteers, wouldn't look too hard at a kid who insisted he was old enough and had a piece of paper to prove it. In August 1942, 9 months after Pearl Harbor and a few months after his 12th birthday, Calvin Graham walked into the Navy recruitment office in Houston. He wore clothes borrowed from older boys, styled his hair to look more mature, and carried himself with every ounce of false confidence he could muster. His heart hammered so hard he was sure everyone could hear it, but he kept his face blank and his voice steady. When the recruiter asked his age, Calvin looked him straight in the eye and said 18. The man glanced at him, a moment of assessment that felt like it lasted forever, and Calvin forced himself not to flinch, not to look away, not to show even a flicker of the terror screaming through his mind. The recruiter looked back down at the paperwork. He asked a few more questions. Calvin answered each one with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his head. Then, unbelievably, the man nodded and pushed a form across the desk for Calvin to sign. Just like that, it worked. Calvin Graham, 12 years old, 4'11", and 95 pounds, became a sailor in the United States Navy. He was assigned to boot camp, where the real test began. Boot camp was brutal for everyone, but for Calvin it was a special kind of ordeal. He had to keep up with men 5 and 6 years older, men with adult strength and stamina. Every morning brought physical challenges that pushed his small body to its absolute limits. The drill instructors screamed in everyone's faces, but when they screamed at Calvin, he saw something flicker in their eyes sometimes, a momentary confusion, as if they couldn't quite reconcile what they were seeing with what they expected. But nobody said anything. The machine had accepted him, and the machine kept moving forward. Calvin learned to tie knots and read signal flags. He learned the parts of a ship in the chain of command. He learned how to salute properly and how to stand at attention until his legs shook with exhaustion. And he learned, crucially, how to hide his age from the other recruits. He stayed quiet during conversations about home and family, deflecting questions with vague answers. When the other sailors talked about their lives before the war, jobs they'd held or schools they'd graduated from, Calvin would nod and offer nothing. Some of them noticed he was young. Some of them probably suspected the truth. But there was an unspoken agreement in the barracks. Everyone was scared. Everyone was pretending to be braver than they felt. And if the kid in the corner was pretending to be older, well, that was just one more lie in a world suddenly full of them. After boot camp, Calvin received his assignment. He was ordered to report to the USS South Dakota, one of the newest and most powerful battleships in the American fleet. The South Dakota was a floating city of steel, bristling with guns and armor, a symbol of American industrial might. For Calvin, walking up the gangway and stepping onto that deck for the first time must have felt surreal. He had gone from a terrified child in an abusive home to a sailor on one of the most formidable warships in the world. He had done it by lying. But he had done it. Now came the part where he had to survive what came next. The South Dakota sailed west, toward the Pacific Theater, where the war against Japan raged across thousands of miles of ocean. The ship joined the fleet protecting the Solomon Islands, where American and Japanese forces were locked in a vicious struggle for control. The fighting there was unlike anything the American public back home could truly comprehend. It was desperate, brutal, and unforgiving. Ships clashed in the darkness, firing at each other at point-blank range. Planes screamed out of the sky to drop bombs and torpedoes. Men died in ways that were never fully explained in the newsreels and newspaper reports. And Calvin Graham, 12 years old, was sailing directly into the heart of it. In November 1942, the South Dakota and several other American ships were ordered to intercept a Japanese force near Guadalcanal. Intelligence indicated that the Japanese were planning to bombard Henderson Field, the critical airstrip that allowed American planes to control the surrounding area. If the Japanese succeeded, it would shift the entire balance of the Solomon Islands campaign. The American ships had to stop them, no matter the cost. As the South Dakota steamed through the dark Pacific waters, the crew prepared for battle. Ammunition was brought up from the magazines. Damage control teams stood ready with fire hoses and repair equipment. Gun crews loaded their weapons and waited. Calvin was assigned to one of the damage control teams, a position that would put him right in the middle of whatever hell was about to unfold. The Battle of Guadalcanal began shortly after midnight on November 15th. The darkness was absolute. The kind of thick tropical night where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The American ships detected the Japanese force on radar, and suddenly the ocean erupted into chaos. Star shells burst overhead, flooding the scene with harsh, flickering light that turned the sea into a nightmare landscape of shadows and glare. Ships fired at each other, from distances measured in yards, not miles. The South Dakota's massive guns roared, shaking the entire ship with each blast. The noise was beyond deafening. It was a physical presence that crushed against your chest and made it hard to breathe. Calvin stood with his damage control team, trying to keep his legs steady as the deck shuddered beneath him. Then the Japanese found them. A salvo of shells slammed into the South Dakota superstructure, and the world became fire and flying metal. Explosions tore through compartments, killing men instantly and wounding dozens more. The ship's electrical system failed, plunging sections into darkness and knocking out fire control systems. More shells hit, and more, each impact sending shockwaves through the hull. Calvin's damage control team rushed toward the fires, dragging hoses and equipment through smoke so thick it choked the breath from their lungs. All around him, men were screaming, some giving orders, some crying for help, some making sounds that weren't words at all, just raw expressions of pain and terror. A piece of shrapnel, white-hot and jagged, tore through Calvin's face. The pain was instant and overwhelming, a burning agony that spread from his jaw through his skull. He tasted blood and felt teeth loose in his mouth. For a moment, everything went white, and he nearly collapsed. But the training, the desperate need to survive kicked in. He stayed on his feet. There were men on fire, men trapped under debris, men bleeding out on the deck. Calvin pushed through his own pain and helped pull a wounded sailor away from a burning compartment. The man was twice Calvin's size and weight, but adrenaline and sheer determination gave Calvin the strength to drag him to safety. He helped others, moving through the chaos as shells continued to fall, and the ship shuddered under the impacts. The battle lasted 2.5 hours, though for the men aboard the South Dakota it felt like days. By the time the Japanese force withdrew, the ship was badly damaged. Dozens of men were dead, and many more were wounded. The South Dakota had taken 42 hits and had come terrifyingly close to sinking. As the sun rose over the Pacific, the crew began the grim work of assessing the damage and treating the wounded. Calvin, his face swollen and bloodied, was taken to the ship's medical bay. The doctor who examined him stopped, stared, and asked a question that would change everything. "How old are you, sailor?" Calvin tried to maintain the lie. He insisted he was 18, but the words came out slurred and painful through his damaged jaw. The doctor wasn't buying it. He had seen enough young men to know the difference between 18 and whatever Calvin actually was. The medical officer reported his suspicions up the chain of command, and suddenly Calvin Graham's war was over in a different way than he had imagined. The Navy began investigating. They contacted Fort Worth, tracked down records, and discovered the truth. Calvin was 12 years old. He had lied to enlist, forged documents, and somehow made it through boot camp and into combat without anyone stopping him. The revelation created a bureaucratic nightmare. Here was a child who had been wounded in combat while serving in the United States Navy. He had earned a Purple Heart for his wounds and a Bronze Star for his actions during the battle, helping to save wounded sailors while injured himself. But he should never have been there in the first place. The Navy's response was not what you might expect. Rather than quietly acknowledge the failure of their recruitment and training systems, rather than admitting that a 12-year-old child had slipped through multiple layers of oversight, the Navy decided to make Calvin the problem. They stripped him of his medals. They claimed he had disgraced the uniform by lying about his age. Then, instead of simply discharging him and sending him home with an apology and perhaps some compensation for his wounds, they threw him in the brig. Calvin Graham, who had been decorated for heroism under fire, was now a prisoner. The logic was twisted but grimly bureaucratic. Calvin had committed fraud by enlisting under false pretenses. The fact that the Navy had failed to catch an obvious child during recruitment was conveniently set aside. The fact that he had served honorably and bravely, that he had been wounded while helping save lives, didn't matter. What mattered was protecting the institution from embarrassment. Calvin spent months in military prison. When he was finally released, he received a dishonorable discharge, the kind of discharge reserved for serious misconduct. At 13 years old, Calvin Graham had a military record that branded him a fraud and a liar. He went back to Texas, back to a world that had no idea what to do with a child who had survived combat in the Pacific. The physical wounds healed slowly. His jaw never quite recovered, leaving him with permanent pain and difficulty eating. But the deeper wounds, the ones that came from being used and discarded by the system he had sacrificed himself for, those were harder to measure. Calvin tried to go back to being a kid, but that possibility had died somewhere in the darkness off Guadalcanal. He tried to fit back into school. But how do you sit in a classroom learning basic math when you've seen men die in front of you? How do you listen to teenagers complain about their problems when you've pulled burning bodies from wreckage? For decades, Calvin Graham's story was forgotten. The Navy had buried it, embarrassed by the truth of what had happened. Calvin himself struggled through life, working various jobs, dealing with the physical and psychological aftermath of what he had experienced. He married, had children, and tried to build a normal life. But the shadow of what happened never left him. In the 1970s, a journalist discovered Calvin's story and began investigating. Other sailors who had served on the South Dakota came forward, confirming Calvin's presence and his actions during the battle. Veterans who had been there remembered the small kid who had worked alongside them, who had shown courage when it mattered most. Slowly, pressure began to build on the military to acknowledge what had really happened. It took until 1978, 36 years after the Battle of Guadalcanal, for the Navy to finally correct their records. They restored Calvin's honorable discharge, admitting implicitly that punishing him had been wrong. But they still wouldn't give him back his medals. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star that Calvin had earned with his blood and his courage remained officially stripped from his record. The fight continued, with Calvin and his supporters pushing for full recognition. Calvin testified before Congress, telling his story to lawmakers who seemed shocked that such a thing could have happened. How, they asked, could the system have failed so completely? Calvin's answer was simple. Nobody wanted to look too closely. The country needed soldiers and sailors, and a kid who was willing to fight was easier to accept than a recruitment system that needed to slow down and do its job properly. Finally, in 1994, more than 50 years after he had lied his way into the Navy, President Bill Clinton awarded Calvin Graham his Purple Heart in a formal ceremony. The Bronze Star took even longer, not being restored till after Calvin's death. Calvin Graham died in 1992 at the age of 62. His body worn out by a lifetime of dealing with the wounds he had received as a child. He never saw the full restoration of his honors, never got the complete acknowledgement that what he had done mattered, and that how he had been treated was wrong. His death came quietly, without the fanfare or national attention that you might think would accompany the passing of someone with such an extraordinary story. What makes Calvin Graham's story so haunting is not just that a child ended up in combat, but what it reveals about the systems that let it happen. Every step of Calvin's journey into the Navy should have been stopped by someone. The recruiter who accepted his obviously forged documents should have looked harder. The officers at boot camp who saw a child among the recruits should have asked questions. The sailors who served alongside him should have reported their suspicions. But nobody did. And the reason nobody did is because on some level, everyone involved had an incentive not to see the truth. The recruiter had a quota to fill. The boot camp instructors had orders to turn out sailors as fast as possible. The other recruits weren't going to rat out someone they saw as pulling his weight. And Calvin himself, of course, desperately wanted the lie to be believed. The Navy's response after the truth came out revealed something even darker. Rather than accepting responsibility for the failure, the institution chose to punish the child who had exposed that failure simply by existing. Stripping Calvin of his medals and giving him a dishonorable discharge wasn't about justice or military discipline. It was about protecting the Navy's reputation, about making sure that the story became about one boy's lie rather than about a system that was so eager for bodies that it stopped asking the questions it should have asked. In punishing Calvin, the Navy was trying to erase its own culpability, to turn a story about institutional failure into a story about individual deception. The years Calvin spent fighting for recognition, the decades it took for the military to finally admit they had wronged him, those years speak to how hard it is for powerful institutions to acknowledge their mistakes. It's easier to blame a 12-year-old for lying than to admit that your recruitment and training systems were so overwhelmed or so careless that they put a child on a warship in combat. It's easier to strip away medals than to face the uncomfortable question of how many other corners were cut, how many other checks and balances failed during those desperate early years of the war. When America was scrambling to build an army and navy large enough to fight on two fronts simultaneously, Calvin Graham was 12 years old when he earned the right to be called a hero, and 13 when his country decided to call him a criminal instead. The fact that it took half a century to partially correct that injustice should tell us something about how institutions protect themselves, even at the expense of the people who serve them. Calvin's story is a reminder that behind every statistic, every ship, every battle in the history books, there were individual human beings with their own stories, their own pain, their own reasons for being there. Some of those reasons, like Calvin's desperate need to escape an abusive home, had nothing to do with patriotism or duty and everything to do with survival. War doesn't just consume the willing and the ready, it consumes whoever happens to be within reach, even children, and then it asks us to forget the parts of the story that don't fit the heroic narrative we want to tell.